actually asked Pat to talk a little bit about finding those stats and stacks, what really got this whole move, not just for the film, but also for the exhibit you see here, the earlier exhibits at the Cape Cod Museum and others. Can you talk about what you discovered?
Yes, right. Well, first of all, I should say I started studying with Sam when I just got out of college, and I met him while I was in college, and had the opportunity to study with him then on the Cape, and then later in Philadelphia. I began taping him at that point, cassettes, and I had a lot of them, and transcribed about 400 pages. There were long winters. I was living in upstate New York, and he was so profound in the lessons he gave to life in general, to say nothing of art, and I was painting at the time, etc. And so I had that, and then later I studied with him in New York, and eventually we got married, and I taught with him for 17 years in Toronto. We never once spoke about what would happen to his work. He did talk about the fact that El Greco's work had been lost for centuries, and it was just a historian who found his work when she was going down to Spain and actually researching Velasquez. And so suddenly there's El Greco, and of course he's become a treasure to so many artists, from Cezanne straight on through. We understand, how profoundly he saw and created his own world on canvas. But Sam said, well, it probably didn't matter to El Greco where he was. So after Sam passed, I was teaching art and art history at a private school, and then I had a sabbatical, and I said, I want to see what are in these rooms that have paintings stacked in front of the doors of rooms on the top floor of our brownstone. And I began getting them out, and I just, was swept away by it ever since. I retired early from my teaching, and I already was offered a retrospective at the Cape Cod Museum of Art. We lived around the corner from there, and someone came and saw his work at a memorial we had in 2003. It was an outdoor show, and also inside his studio, you saw a little bit of the inside when he was talking about shifting things from place to place. That was a little shack way up high on his property behind his house. And then he had a teaching studio down nearer the house, the white barn that you saw. And that's where he had the still life and was describing the still life. So out came all these paintings. And he had saved everything, all kinds of scraps of paper, everything. I have suitcases of his writings. He was constantly writing, constantly trying to think about how to explain the importance of art, how to explain what it really was as nature's energies going through human beings, not self-expression, but the energies of all nature being allowed to flow through, whether it was creating music or creating poetry or whatever. He really believed it was an extension of nature's most positive energies, and that's what plasticity is everywhere. The apple tree trying to create a perfect apple might not happen, but it wasn't aiming to create something less than that. And he saw art as that being what was needed for all human beings. And so when I found all these works, I started working on shows for him, started planning shows, reaching out, but his students reached out to me too. One of the first shows was in Princeton, and it was one of his students who was there, and I went to see her, and she said, oh, you have a show, etc. And so it began, and it's just snowballed since then. So I have sort of altogether done about 10 shows, and lucky happenstance to meet people like Barbara Willanen, curated the show here, and also helped to curate the Group 55 show in Philadelphia. So I've had many wonderful people along the way that have helped, and all of these, Nancy interviewed 20 students, and there were more who were left behind, and this is 20 years almost after he died. And just amazing interviews, and some of these we hope to put on the website, on our Vimeo website, because the whole interviews are fascinating as well. So that's how I got started, and then along the way, it was Victoria who introduced me to Nancy, and then together we worked on this particular film. I couldn't be more happy with it. I think it's a beautiful expression of who he is, and I hope it prompts a lot of questions and responses about what is art, where should it be, what is art education, how do we learn, how do we open up and be aware and present and learning all the time about whatever it is, in life. So thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say there's a couple of people who aren't here tonight that I do want to acknowledge as well. So we talked about all the materials we had, which was probably just a videotape, audio tape, Zoom interviews, because this was the pandemic. And, it was probably about 75 to 80 hours of audio and video media. I think something like 1,800 still photos, documents, things like that, and of course, close to 1,000 paintings to work with. Part of that, Pat had the foresight to start doing this videotaping of all these classes. But as some of you may know, when videotape sits around for a while, it can feel a little less than optimum. And we had a wonderful man who is an artist in his own right in restoring and doing color and video. And it's Evan Schwenterly at Clips Video. And I want to thank him for the beautiful work of restoring images that would not have been usable without his help. And then the other person who's not here tonight, whose contribution is enormous, is Bruce Barth, a jazz pianist that I've collaborated with over the years. And he did some direct improvisation picture, and we went back and forth, but also gave us permission to use some recordings of both live recordings and note recordings for the music. And I think it both suited Sam and his work, and really want to thank Bruce. Julie also really worked hard on the still photos and still images to make sure they were at their optimum. So on the technical things, I wanted to thank you and Bruce and Evan who aren't here. Michael, I want to come back to an early Sam story that you told me. And again, when you have 75 to 80 hours, there's stories that you really wish you could include, and you can't. But talking about your first encounter with Sam and in the shack, in the painter shack.
Check. Yes, so the neighborhood I grew up on had a dead end. It was a dead end road, and the neighborhood kids would get together and play. And the painter's shack was through the woods at the end of the dead end road. But we didn't know it was a painter's shack. We just thought it was the haunted shack. There was a shack in the middle of the woods where you didn't go back there, you weren't supposed to go back there. And so, we would dare each other to go back there. So I have one vivid memory of being the leader of the pack, going up to the window and peeking my head in and seeing this golden glow and a television that was, furry state, and he was hiding behind the window, and he jumped out and yelled at me. We all ran through the woods like crazy, finding myself up with thorns and stuff, and so that, and I didn't internalize that really until years later. I was working at a restaurant, and the waitress said, I'm a painter, and I go to this, you have to come. You're an artist, you're in high school, you got to come to this workshop. And And I was like, well, where is it? She's like, it's right there on Wake Street, Dennis, and lo and behold, like showing up at the barn and realizing his studio was in the back, in the woods, and oh my God, this is the guy. And, yeah, so great coincidence and amazing, and even, I don't think it was it was not right away. I was even shown the shack, his studio was very private. We were only brought up there once or twice a summer, and if you missed that day, you missed it. You weren't gonna, get a retake. So it was a special thing to be able to be just the kid in the neighborhood who sort of stumbles upon this master painter. And I've had great art teachers, but he was the greatest. And I continue to paint and practice as an artist, and it's the best redeeming quality for the film for me right now, after seeing it the second time, is that art can be like going for a walk, or making art can be something you're supposed to do as a human. That green light, that encouragement through the film is great. So it encourages me to make more art, regardless of whether it's finished or admired or sold. It's something that I'm going to do for the rest of my life, and I have him to thank for it. And Pat, obviously, and all of you people that work on these archival projects, Paul, as well. It's awesome when people recognize that something should be documented, because it's not as exciting as painting. And so you guys did a great job, and I'm grateful for it, because of the memory. I want to watch it as a reminder of why we're doing what we do when we're interested in being creative. We're just trying to pass on or pass through, take the great parts of life and allow them to come through you and create something. It's great. He just taught creativity so well that I feel like I apply it, whether I'm cooking or teaching my kid or gardening. There's just sort of always a little bit of him, thinking about balance. And, but he was a reclusive guy, and he scared the heck out of me that day. He was a scary guy at times.
Anytime anyone has a question, just raise your hand, and I'll keep them going until somebody raises your hand. Raise them. Paul, we talked a little earlier that your relationship to Sam was a little different, and I wanted you to ask if you would tell your background story with him, and how he changed your life.
Well, I never really was painting with Sam, but my wife painted with Sam in the barn on Wake Street, and that was in the late 70s, and she would come back and tell stories about the still life and just the creative process, and a little bit of the intimidation by Sam's presence there, and the lineup. And that was curious to me. And then over a period of time, during the 78, 79, 80, I would see Sam socially, and I was interested. He was a very interesting person, and I didn't understand his lifestyle. I had no background in art. I went to surgery. I went to medical school. I just didn't have that side of my brain on music. I wasn't using it. And when in 1980, when Anita died, Sam came back to the Cape, and my wife said, Sam's a non-father, why don't you have some time, why don't you go down and just say hello and sit there, and maybe, maybe it'll be good for Sam. And that's what I did. I spent some of that summer going down. My wife worked away from home. She was a flight attendant, so she would be away some periods of time. And during that time, I had the ability to sit with Sam, to listen to him, to also to reach into to ask him questions about the creative process, because I didn't understand it And I would like to, I was curious as to how he did what he did and how he thought about making a painting. I was more curious about the mental concept of making the painting more than his actual putting the paint on the canvas. And Sam was so articulate that he could literally paint a picture with words. And it was it was just curious for me to spend that time with him. And then eventually I could see some of his paintings, and I could, by just listening to him, I could see how some of these concepts were showing up on the canvas. And from that, those conversations that we had over that year, and maybe the next year, Sam got to know a little bit about me, and he said, how do you spend your free time? And I did a lot of athletic things, and Sam was saying, well, I can tell from our conversations that you probably have a creative side of your personality, and I think that it's good for people to explore that. I said, and I said, well, that'd be interesting. I don't have any interest in painting. And through the conversations, I met a potter, Harry Hall, who was up in Scarborough Pottery, who was a friend of Sam's. And just by happenstance, I saw that 3D creative world, and it really excited me because it was physical, the dimensionality, and it was magical, that creative process of taking a piece of clay thrown from a spinning wheel and creating something really beautiful. So, from the conversations and from the time that I spent with Sam, and eventually thinking about that creativity may play a role in my life, and then running into Harry at the same time, it was pretty much a change for me. And it's like in my education, I think in college and in Tufts, where I went to school, you'd run into one teacher that changed your life. One teacher was inspirational in a way that you wanted to do as best that you could do for that person. You were motivated by that as something very special. And that's my relationship to Sam. I think and that led me to seek out Sam over time when he had this show. I said, the time that I spent with Sam has been so interesting to me. And Sam doesn't show, he may never show again. Let me make the effort to get on film what he says about the paintings. Let me see if I can convince him to do it. And he was very eager to do it. And when it came down to it, we went over to Scarborough Pottery, and I picked Sam up in the Jeep that I had. And I think I said to Sam, are you ready for this? He said, just ask me a question. And then he went on for hours. Anyway, that's my relationship to Sam.
You also had some of his paintings in your professional office. You mentioned that those had had kind of a unique impact on some patients.
Well, yes, okay. There's one of the things that I did for years, Sam, on Wig Street, the house wasn't really suited to leave all those paintings in there. I don't think it was secure, and when he would come back in the spring, sometimes the mice would come in and the paintings would be, not what he wanted. So I opted to store the paintings in my office, which was a few miles from his house. And some of them were rolled canvases, but other ones were framed paintings. So I just hung them on the walls of my office. And none of my staff had any idea what are these paintings. They didn't understand the paintings. But for me, it was incredibly motivational to leave these paintings and to see them. And then patients would come in, they were quite curious about them, and especially patients from Provincetown. There were eventually people that just would drive up to South Yarmouth, Massachusetts, even if they were going to Boston, just pull off and come in the office to look at the paintings. They were extremely paintings. And then I remember one New Year's Eve, I told Pat this, but I had some of the roll canvases stored in a small wine cellar in my basement. And we had a couple of friends who were also in Sam's class, and we just sort of unrolled the canvas, had a little champagne, and took a look at the painting. It was like we went to this greatest gallery. But there was I'm spacing on the man's name, but he owned the A House in Provincetown.
Reggie Cabral.
Right. He would come by, and he was just in awe of the paintings. And he would just sit there, and he'd say, I'm not going back near you, but I want to look at these paintings. It was cool, by the way.
Judy, and again, please just flag us down if there's something that you'd like to ask. So one of the stories that I told you about was, and we've discussed how important that concept of painting being something religious, that there was really a sacredness to what you were doing. And you told me a story about dust. And perhaps you could talk a little bit how Sam approached that still life, the intensity that you get from the film, but beyond that.
Sure. It's a weird thing. It has to do with the still life, which everybody, when they would first see the still life in any of the still lives, either in Venice or Philadelphia or in New York, people, when they saw it the first time, they would be shocked. Actually, a lot of people, and myself included, when I first saw one of Sam's paintings, I didn't really understand what was going on, but I knew from the people who were showing it to me that it was something that I probably should pay attention to. They were worshipful. So I took it seriously and really tried to figure out what was going on. But the studio itself was also pretty off-putting if you were sort of raised maybe around Impressionist painting or the old masters or something like that. But it didn't take long to study with Sam before you were told something like that realism and say figurative work and so forth were actually the same thing as abstraction. The two work together. The language of Rembrandt was really the language of abstraction, more energized. And when you did abstraction, you're just jumping right into the rhythm and vibrancy of the energy itself. Now, the still life was often very off-putting. The Philadelphia one was particularly disturbing for Barbara Crawford, his first wife, who I had known since I was a teenager. And she objected to it in the summertime because it was filthy. It would gather all this dust. When Sam had to go to the Cape, she would gleefully decide that she was going to clean it. But she said, don't say anything, because he'll notice. If I take off too much of the sacred dust. What do you mean by the sacred dust? Each piece of paper, lampshade, upside down stool, old broken guitar, and so forth, had a film of collected city soot and grime on it, which Sam would, in class, apparently, I never saw him actually do this, but Barbara insisted that they did on more than one occasion, that if you changed anything, or if you messed up with the still life, the flow of the light from one object to the other would actually be different from season to season. And the students wouldn't have the same effect that they would have had in a prior season. So it's an anecdotal story about the sacred dust. It had to remain there, having to do from object to object, and color to color, and the integrity of what was going on with that of nature that the student eventually was learning to also find in their own painting, in their own examination of the color exactitude. So that was what the sacred dust was about that. I might just touch on also that Sam had a whole thing about what was sacred, and that art was very close to this very sacred inner human thing, which actually, those of you who are new to this whole thing, it could be a little weird. But in fact, because the artistic activity of making this transcendent form was so key to what he was talking about, and what he thought was true of all great artists, Rembrandt, Cézanne, Van Gogh, the list just goes on. Their energy, what they were attempting to do was similar to what all great creative people throughout time, in the past, but even in the future, were attempting to do in plastic association from form to form, both in nature and in creative act, in painting. That's what they were trying to do, and you would explain that by making people remember what the word religion came from, which was the Latin word religare. It's sort of like the sacred text, it's a little bit related. So the religare was the Latin for the word religion, which means to be rejoined. So when you're doing this activity, you would tell the class, and when anybody attempts painting, this core ability is actually in every human being, he would insist, especially children. Children decide that they, sooner or later, maybe they can't do it or they channel it in different ways, but that all human beings have this associative capacity, and he would say that sense of being rejoined is what happens when you get into the creative act. And that he was adamant. It's a very interesting thing. Sorry if I went along.
No, this is great. They know to jump in if they want something, but
Jump there.
I am going to continue with Kara. And one of the things that we talked quite a bit about, Kara, was that before you started studying with Sam, you were in Ontario as an outdoor educator, and that your connection with nature and Sam's, this actually gets to the sacredness in a different way, and that Sam's connection to nature, this philosophy, which really, and maybe we're talking a little bit about that and how that affected your painting, and do that whole period of life.
Okay, how that makes sense. I spent a lot of time on an island in the middle of a huge lake in Ontario, like 45 miles away from the nearest phone or electricity. So I had every summer for almost 20 years to do a lot of viewing of nature and how it changed the weather and all of that. And before I went, of course, I had painted a bit, but stopped doing anything artistic because I was involved in raising children and camps and that kind of thing. But afterward, I started a business, this wonderful gallery my husband and I had for 30 years. And Barry Bushy, who you saw on the film, came in one day and he said, I think you need to come with me to Sam's painting studio. I think you'd really like Sam, and I think you'd like what he has to offer. So I thought, wow, this is really interesting. I haven't painted for so long to go into somebody's studio and start painting again, but I did. And when I saw the still life, it was shocking and wonderful. It was just like, it didn't make any sense at all. And that's what made sense to me at that point. He was such a tough guy in some ways. He was so, to me, he was gruff and clear. And that, to my sensibilities, was difficult. And he invited me in and sat down and I started painting in the way that I learned to paint in art school. And very quickly I learned that there was so much more to painting than I had ever been taught. And I started to trust my own inner story, which is the story that we just saw on the movie. He was so welcoming to me and to, I'm sure, of everyone that he worked with, to bring their own, to join that river of human consciousness that they could own and Brink as a contributing factor to moving us forward, all of us forward. And what a bit of freedom that is as a human being, to be welcome, that what you're bringing is as important as everything everyone else is bringing. It just frees you to do what you can do. And it's such a simple thing, but it's such a complicated thing for me and a lot of people to overcome their own barriers, to be free and to release that energy. So I'm painting, I've been painting ever since that day I've been painting. And I'm retired now, and I've been painting every day. And I think of Sam all the time, and I think of him when I feed the birds outside, and I see the feathers, and I see the clouds, and all my camp experience comes back, my Native American rituals, and canoeing, and all of the beauty that I've experienced comes back through Sam's words. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So thank you for the opportunity to tell that story. And Sam was quite a guy. He was quite a guy. And I want to say one other thing. At the end, we had all our painting lineups, and depending on how many people were there were like 10 or maybe 15, 20. But what happened in the lineups, and I know this happens in other painting classes, but the lineup together is its own story, and it gets reinforced over and over again that what we bring to that lineup, what we bring to our painting, what we bring to the world, it's all important. And each painting informed the other painting. And there's another thing too. I never saw any of Sam's paintings the whole time I painted with him. I never saw one. And then there was a show when he passed away. I came to that show, and that was the first time I saw his paintings in 2003.
Yes, 2003.
I started painting with him in like 1991, something like that. And I see now in my own paintings, I see Sam in my own paintings, but they're very different. But the color's there, and the movement's there, and the life is there, and I just feel so very grateful to have had that experience. And I hope other people can get some of that juice out of the paintings in the other room. Thank you.
Christine, it kind of follows well what you were saying about that voice that remains with you. That's something that we talked about when I interviewed you. You said you hear his voice all the time, and also kept a notebook that with Sam's quotes. It was really great because I knew some of the real key things to look for from Christine in her notebook. But you also talked about your own struggle as someone who came in as a figurative painter, and to figure out how to take Sam's teaching into that realm and reconcile the abstract painter and figurative painter. And we talked about that in relationship to some of your paintings, but maybe you can talk about how that dialogue was with Sam and how that evolved for you and how that's affected your ongoing.
So as almost everybody said, seeing the still life was, for me, really intimidating. Can you hear me? A little? Yeah. Seeing the still life was really intimidating. And I really didn't know how to approach it. And I hope I can say this right, but he said, a painting of a noble is no more noble than a painting of a pile of junk. And once you start to really observe and paint that pile of junk, then you're going beyond the concepts of the objects, and you're really painting. That really stuck with me. So that really informs, just keeps informing me in that way. To be in touch with the actual observation that's right in front of you. Try to not be attached to the concept so much, and that really is a fun and exciting way to work.
So I'm going to check, I was going to say, check with the audience and see if there are any questions, and we'll start to,
Yeah, it's kind of a question, I know I will regret saying this. It's just that I was a history major back in the day, and when I hear you guys talk about, the sacredness and rejoining, and even with the dust and not ruining anything, and like that everything should be good and belong. And I look at the timing of his family leaving Europe before the big war, or the Second War, and then I see him actually like fighting in the war from and if his family hadn't left Europe, then what would have happened? So when you talk about his vast appreciation for the way things, for the beauty in all things that we should see, it just, I can't help but see those dates about when they left Europe,
I think that's a really good observation, and there is, again, the layers of things that we could have included. Sam actually applied to be a conscientious objector during the war because and wrote this wonderful letter that, again, it just didn't fit into a 40-minute film. Wrote a wonderful letter saying why, as an artist, he could not, participate in, destruction. That he was there to create, not to destroy. The army didn't buy it, but he did, fortunately, he then enlisted and worked in camouflage first, then medical illustration, and then the now very famous Army Pictorial Center, where films like Why We Fight were made, and he did learn filmmaking. So that is, that history, I think that's one of the interesting things, is that his story is part of the story of immigrants of that time. And if you looked at other people who were parallel, whose stories are parallel to his, or, artists or musicians or writers or scientists, it's a very interesting group of people and a very difficult time.
He also was a gatherer, or a collector, or borderline hoarder. He basically had that sense of responsibility to objects, and he would just go from street to street and collect and keep it. He would find a useful purpose for that at some point in his life, up until he died. But there was, and then everybody else had to sort it out. But he thought everything had their purpose. Whether it was going to be on a still life, he was going to use it as construction, repair, or a studio. He was a character that way. I know exactly, because he took all my old clothing. And he would wear it, and see it in the film. He'd say, oh, I like the color of that shirt. I'll take that shirt home with me. So I think that came from his origins.
Just any other questions? I just want to give our associate producers a chance to say, just a brief answer to a question I had. As people who have been immersed in Sam and his work, who did not study, they are both painters and artists. And is there anything you would like to say about how you think even just experiencing Sam's painting, how that's how that's affected you? And then we'll do the rest. Yeah,
What I really appreciated, one thing I really appreciate about working on this film is I received lessons from everyone on this stage, or on this side of things, because I learned from the inherited wisdom of each of you, and it made me wish that Sam had been my teacher and that I had gotten to be with all of you, because I never had an art teacher who could free me that way, and I had to find that on my own, and there wasn't that much reinforcement. So I felt more invigorated and, returned to some of my artistic practices that I dabble and go in and out of. And I think the said, begin where you are and just go forward, and that's a great gift. And, you can insert yourself into the current of life along with everyone else. And that we all, and Pat said it too, we're all born with that. And she said it was teaching at, Sam teaching at Chestnut Hill that sort of really reinforced that, teaching children. And I think maybe Paul just said, I'm not sure who just said that children have it, but then we lose it as we're conditioned to be very pragmatic, and we get detached from the current of things. And so I appreciated being re-immersed in that and being reminded that we don't have to stay out of it because someone else is doing it instead. We can be part of it as well. And so I've enjoyed, returning to painting and being reminded of this idea of reconnection, and that we're inheritors of that, and we're contributors to it as well.
Well, this was just an extraordinary experience. I mean, it was, before we actually started filmmaking, it was about 2 years of preparation just to kind of wrap our heads around all of the content that we had to deal with. I think that one thing that was extraordinary to me was to just experience how long people studied the Sam. They studied with him for decades. And after that, they continued to paint. And I find that extraordinary these days when there's so many other distractions. And I feel as though, looking at Sam's work, I'm reminded that art is the ultimate expression of gratitude. It allows us to observe the world in a way that we could forget to look, and it reminds us to look, it reminds us to appreciate and enjoy and give ourselves the bliss of being in this spectacular planet. I mean, it brings us alive, and it allows us to spread that life to other people through our artwork. So, although we didn't study with Sam, I was hoping that the film would accomplish the execution and the kind of passing on of his philosophical approach to art in words that I've never heard used to describe making art before. So hopefully the film has accomplished that. I do want to say I have such great respect and just great, huge, enormous fondness for the filmmakers who just could not settle, just persevered until we got it just right. And also for Pat, whose enormous heart and great commitment to her husband's work and to the work of all artists who could benefit from Sam's work. She just didn't give up. She can't tell you, she pushed through so many times how difficult it has been and how rewarding the final product is. And we so appreciate you coming and sharing this with us today.
And I want to pick up on the gratitude for these wonderful people, for the people who are in the film who have come from so